Okay, this next section is about major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, and eating disorders. So section 2, you guys can review with me. I've got a few videos in there. If you want to watch them, you're not required to, but they might illuminate some of the things that I want to impress upon you, sort of normal people having, issues with their mental health. And then, of course, them sort of talking about their stories, which I think is important. But again, you're going to pick and choose what you decide that you want to watch. The eating disorders one is a tough little section. And again, if there's some of you out there that do have issues with eating and have in the past, it could be triggersome for you. So you could decide to skip that part, or you could watch it, but just know that it may be a trigger for you at that point, okay? Okay, so let's go to depressive and bipolar disorders. So in terms of depressive and bipolar disorders, the quality, intensity, and duration of a person's emotions does not reflect their reality, the reality at all, and normal mood that someone else would have. There's range from extreme sadness to extreme energetic or overconfidence for no apparent reason. There are mood changes that persist longer than a normal person. So even if you are moody, it does not mean that you have a disorder per se. It would be something that would have to have a duration to it and also an intensity to it. There's also quite a bit of disturbed moods and emotions, and that's why they're called mood disorders or affective disorders. And they both are a distinct category as listed in DSM-5 now. In terms of MAD, or sorry, instead of in terms of major depressive disorder, or MDD, this of course affects the entire person. So in your textbook, it had the emotional, cognitive, and behavioral and physical effects. When we talk about emotional, definitely a feeling of sadness, of course, disconnect from others and turning away from other people. In terms of cognitive, is a difficult concentrating and sort of having this global pessimism and so forth. And then behavioral, you're going to see somebody definitely have some various eye contact issues and facial expressions, their gestures and maybe just like slow down, for instance, lack of pleasure in normal activities and withdrawal from social activities. And then physically, when we talk about that, it's like what's going on with the body is like a loss of appetite. So there might be some weight loss or gain even, insomnia, some aches and pains, diminished things like sexual interest or mental energy going down, and feelings of anxiety and restlessness. So MDD has two hallmarks and risks. One is suicide and the other one is abnormal sleep patterns, which doesn't help with the cyclical side and depression and anxiety. So with suicide, it's because of that global pessimism that the world and the future is very negative, and that 10% of people with major depressive disorder attempt suicide. And then they also have very abnormal sleep patterns, which is also a key part of MDD. And that's they have that reduced, really restful sleep with that non-dreaming sleep, and they spend sporadic REM periods in various lengths and different nights. And so they wake up frequently during the night, very restless and so forth. They can't go to sleep, although they're very exhausted, and it's shown with that with the lack of energy. And it's less common to have excessive sleep. I think some people think depressed people sleep excessively, and people can, but it's less common to see that. So, and we talked about before is that one of the D's and what psychiatrists and psychologists use is called duration. And we talked about the duration for the diagnosis is 2 weeks or longer. So if someone is experiencing these symptoms for that long, if it's untreated, it could last up six months or longer. And if untreated, they've seen that it can reoccur in people. 50% of people can expect a relapse within 2 years if they don't get continued treatment after the symptoms have gone away, or at least reduced. Each time then after that, if treatment is not given and continued, the symptoms could increase in severity, and time between those episodes of feeling major depression could also increase. Some of the causes they've talked about is that there's no, in many cases, there's no external reason for persistent feelings as opposed to some other of the disorders. A negative life event um, or a stressful situation or chronic stress can be a trigger. But there's not a lot of cases where there's any particular thing that it can be pointed to. In other cases, things like a significant negative event, like a death of a loved one, could be that stressful event that triggers it. But again, it doesn't have to be something like that. The old versions of DSM put grieving, and grieving was not qualified as a major depressant unless it lasted for 2 months. So they did recognize it, but that time frame had to be 2 months or more, and then they would sort of consider that person was in a depressive state. The DSM-5 now has removed that time frame and has recognized that grief can be like another of those stressful situations or negative life triggers that can trigger major depressive disorder. Also, in terms of causes, we have some related to some other types of disorders that fit under major depressive disorder, and this one's a seasonal affective disorder, and that's where we experience it certain times of the year. So, especially fall and winter, where there's less sunlight, people can get the seasonal disorder based on that. It's more common with women, as many of the disorders are, and people who live in northern latitudes who get less sunlight would also increase this. You can hear about people in Alaska, people in the northern regions of Finland, for instance, who have less sunlight or the similar amount of sunlight throughout the certain seasons of the winter when the sun is tilted away, or the earth is tilted away from the sun, that there's a lot of people with depression and suicide, and also alcoholism is more prominent there. And as you can see, there's about 10 million people that suffer from SAD over the course of the population. That's about in a given year, about 5% of the U.S. population can attribute some depression because of seasonal affective disorder. And then they said some of the coping mechanisms that people can use is to make sure they get a lot of exercise, to meditate, maybe even light therapy, but also if you can, get as much sunlight as possible. But if you're in an area that doesn't have sunlight, or weather is a factor, then getting light therapy of some sort where you are getting that UV light from some other source. And then there's persistent depressive disorder, which is less severe than MDD, and this develops again from a stressful event or trauma. And this is where somebody has like chronic cases of the blues that can continue for years. So the prevalence of MDD it's called the common cold. So it's one of the most prevalent disorders in the world, and in America, for instance. 77% of Americans are affected by MDD, and 15% of Americans will say that they had some kind of symptom over their lifetime. Some state that the number's too low because people haven't really gone in to get any treatment for it because they have dealt with it on their own. As you can see from the chart there is the light green is major depressive episodes with severe impairment. So that's going to extend obviously longer than the dark, which is just having a major depressive episode with severe impairment. So when we look at people not having that number being low, it's like some people aren't maybe reporting it because they haven't had a severe impairment. But you can see from 12 to 17, I kind of grabbed some data from somebody of your age. And around the age of 16 and 17, we see a more of an increase. And then far off to the right there, you see the difference, truly a difference between male and females, and so forth. But in terms of population, it's 11% of the female population in the United States and 10% of those in that age group. So that just gives you an indication of age and so forth. So in terms of a study, they did a longitudinal study of 800 people for 30 years. Again, longitude studies go for a very long period of time, obviously. And then 50% of the people they found in that study, on average, had an episode for 11 weeks. So 11 weeks is a really long time for someone to feel a depressive mode, and to be 50% of the population in this study. These 800 people found that. So that's pretty amazing that a lot of people may be dealing with this. And it also helps with the stigma of depressive disorder that's not so unusual for people to have some kind of symptoms. And they talked about women being twice as likely as men to be diagnosed. And that really goes with the fact that we've talked about in other chapters of women being more vulnerable to greater degrees of chronic stress as being caregivers, and some less sense of personal control. And women just generally tend to dwell on their problems. And then, as we talked about in another chapter, a sense of low mastery. In that intelligence chapter, we talked about how women also feel that sense of being inadequate intelligently because of social pressure. And then that idea of chronic strain again is a reason why women are more prone. Okay, so let's move on to bipolar disorder, the roller coaster. And I have a lot of experience with this. I have a dad who's bipolar, and my sister is bipolar as well. So I'll tell you the difference between the two of them. I've also known people in my life to be bipolar. One in particular was an acquaintance of my husband and I who went through a manic episode. So I'll share with you sort of what that looked like. It was formerly known as manic depression disorder. So I hear it referred to as that. And its symptoms include abnormal moods. You've seen that picture there. That's sort of like the manic state and the depressive state. So they have these extreme mood swings. And it doesn't happen just, abruptly. It really is something that's gradual, but they will go from periods of time where they go through these euphoric stages and all these and then go back to a major depressive disorder type of stage where they have major depression. So the manic episodes are really the more interesting part of bipolar. It's quite, it can vary between people. Not everybody has a manic episode in the same way. And I've seen some that are very extreme and then some that are very mild. So when my dad had, we figured out he had bipolar disorder. He definitely was promiscuous. He went out on my mom. I know I'm sharing that, but that's okay. That happened, 20 years ago, and they ended up getting a divorce. He left my mom, and after that point, he was under a lot of stress, I think, because of the guilt of that. And then because of that, he started having hallucinations. He started talking about his grandeur kinds of parts of his life were that the alien spaceships were going to come down to Earth, and that me and my husband and my kids and him and all of our family were going to get on this ship and we were going to be saved. Like the rest of the Earth was going to go away, and we were going to be the ones that are going to go for this ride. And he wanted me to understand that like I was the chosen one along with him. So that was alarming, obviously. I remember growing up, him wanting to buy a lot of sports cars and, buy boats and things like that. And that we thought that was maybe more of a midlife crisis, but we realize now those were little manic episodes that when stress got even higher for him, it really exploded and he started really making up a lot of things that he really thought were true. A gentleman that we know in the community believed that we knew was bipolar and was having a manic episode, had a helicopter and flew a helicopter in and out of the golf course. He thought the Russians were spying on him. He said he had met with President Trump the week before. He had all these connections to the media. It's one of those things where they just and they have a lot of poor judgment. They do have a lot of rapid sort of speech in terms of giving out these just one after the other kind of delusions and so forth. And they act very inappropriately. Sometimes you can see them dressed like, from somebody who's very conservative, and all of a sudden they're wearing like the newest clothes out of New York. And spending is a huge part. My dad, when he was manic, would just spend, spend, spend. And so one of the things is he's backed off of that, and we haven't seen a manic episode in him for a while. And he's now dealing with the debt that he had from when he had those manic episodes. So, I don't see that rapid cycling of him anymore, 4 more episodes a year. He's not on medication. My sister's on medication, but I'll talk about her in a little bit. She didn't have manic episodes like my dad did. But you can really see that euphoria for several days, and then it kind of calms down. And I never saw him get into a real depressive state, just I saw him get into a more manic state. So again, that person's wildly inflating things. They have self-confidence. The guy that we had talked to in the community that I said about the helicopter was always talking about how he was going to wealth, power, and fame, and that things were really delusional, and they have these false beliefs. One of the things, you know, that at the bottom there on the notes about hospitalization, that people need to be hospitalized so they can protect themselves from consequences. And again, spending is a huge portion. I saw that with my dad and with this gentleman we know. Illegal activity, I didn't see it from either one of them. Uh, Abuse could be like verbal abuse and so forth. One of the things that the gentleman did that we know in the community was he was making false accusations about other people and doing it on social media. And the thing is, people who did not know he was going through a manic state started to believe those things. So I'm going to add even more so to, protecting somebody from themselves, but also protecting them from harming others, which could also happen as well. And so they are very easily distracted with flights of ideas. So they shift from topic to topic. You'll see them do that. And they really talk about very outlandish types of things or really exaggerate their own abilities. What I think my sister has is cyclothymic disorder. She has bipolar, but I think she has more of the moderate one of it. I don't see her to go through a lot of manic things. She does spend and make some decisions, but I don't really think that I would attribute that to a manic, sort of episode like my dad was. And so this is sort of those mood swings. And so extremely moody, very unpredictable, inconsistent. That was my sister for years until she went on to medication. So I would say that's more of what she has. And again, those are family passed along traits. Okay, so in terms of prevalence, you can see that the average age to the right there is around 25, so it's typical in the early 20s, for instance. And 83% of patients have severe symptoms. So having those manic to extreme mood swings into depression. 10 million Americans experience bipolar disease. 50% between men and women, so this one is gender kind of neutral in that case. And then 4, the number of forms the disorder can take. There is a bipolar 1 and 2, and it's all in terms of intensity and severity of symptoms. In terms of mood swings, they start and stop abruptly in terms of, you know, in comparison with major depressive disorder. Manic and depressive states are shorter also than MDD, a few days to a couple of months. And these states transition within days, not minutes or hours. So that's important to recognize. Less common than MDD, obviously, because major depressive disorder is more prevalent, and 1% to develop for men and women in terms of that. So not usually diagnosed in children, although you can see it. It's very careful. They're very careful not to diagnose children yet because they have unstable moods anyway. And so they wait until they get into a more adult kind of state in teens. And reoccurring mental disorders, but usually every couple of years it can reoccur. The treatment, as we'll talk about in chapter 15, is lithium. And if it is not taken, you can have a reoccurrence of the disorder. So in terms of explaining bipolar disorders and depressive disorders, first of all, is because of genetics. And you can see that in my case with running in my family. They've done family twin and adoption studies for both MDD and bipolar, and they've really seen some really genetic roots in there. You can see that with Hemingway's family, with himself, his father, mother, and sister committing suicide. Consequently, in 1961, when he did take his life, his wife wrote in a newspaper that he accidentally shot himself while cleaning his gun, which obviously was not true. Sylvia Plath was married and had children when she took her life as well from her depression, and she ended up ingesting or inhaling carbon monoxide in her kitchen. She put her head in a oven and blocked off the kitchen passageways so that none of the gas would get to her children who were taking naps in the next room. So it's really sad types of stories that ran. And with Sylvia, Mark Twain and Hemingway really see that idea of personality traits that some people were linking artistic temperament to being more prone and vulnerable to depressive disorders, depending on what also had come out in the environment. And so you can really see that even children of parents have exhibit same sort of brain activity. So then it would take something in the environment maybe to trigger that person who's already vulnerable. So also is the difference in activation of structures in the brain. So people who are depressed show increased activation in certain parts of the brain when trying to get rid of negative words that are in their working memory, and they show an effort but may not have enough uh, of an effect for them to get away from the disorder. I also wanted to tell you a few of the biological reasons in terms of brains, like what happens in the brain. So what some scientists and studies have shown is that there's a disruption in early development of the prefrontal and the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, in terms of the white matter connectivity and early pruning that we talked about in terms of development. They think that there's a disruption in that early development. They also believe, after looking at scans, there's a damage or shrinkage in the frontal cortex and basal ganglia, which all have an effect on attention, your executive skills, so organizational skills, things that would be in terms of planning. Bipolar, especially, are not very good at that. And also your emotional functioning. So also that impulse control is affected by the shrinkage of those areas. And then they also have seen abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex. And of course, that has to do with that risky behavior with bipolar, especially that reasoning and thinking for depressive, that global negativity. So there's some real truth to the effects of the brain and biological effects that could lead to disorders. One of the studies that I found that they did with patients, they did two studies. One did the Stroop test, which we did before, where you had the blue background, but the word said green, and you had to say green instead of blue. So they did this with various people who had depressive and bipolar disorders and also anxiety disorders. And they found that they were really had a hard time saying the word and not the color. So you saw that prefrontal frontal cortex really have an issue with those disorders. They also did the facial test where they looked at the expressions. You looked at the expressions, and then you had to say what that person was, either negative, positive, what the expression was, and then they would do a scan of your brain. And what they found was people that did have disorders, the neutral faces, especially people who were bipolar, seemed to look as hot, like they were like angry, even if they were seen to be neutral with most people that were healthy comparison subjects. And so the data, it showed like everyone makes a mistake in interpreting the expressions, especially when they're very, minute differences in them. But when the faces were shown to exhibit more dramatic expressions, so, truly like one or the other, people with bipolar disorder, for instance, made over twice as many mistakes in interpreting than people with a mood or an anxiety problem. So even with between disorders, bipolar by far was the one that had perception that was really affected. And that really goes through where we see with manic episodes, and their perception of what's going on can really be thrown. They can make up a lot of really outlandish stories that are simply not true. So there's definitely a disruption in brain chemistry. That's the third effect, or explaining depressive and bipolar disorders. So the abnormal levels of neurotransmitters, either less or more. So in the old type of antidepressants, they had norepinephrine and serotonin, and they found if increasing those levels, it would help somebody with depression. Glutamate, they've connected that with the idea of using lithium, and lithium regulates the availability of that glutamate. So it prevents both the access, which would create some excitement, so in terms of bipolar, of course, and that would cause mania, and deficiencies that would cause depression. So they've used that to bring glutamate into the system. And then two others, stress and smoking. So stress, we've seen that can be similar triggers. So major depressive disorder and chronic stress have similar changes in the brain, and MDD can be triggered by stressful events. So it could be a good predictor of why a disorder happens. And then more recently, they've done some research on cigarette smoking, and they found that people who are clinically depressed or have some kind of disorder smoke more than people who don't. Um, and people have many disorders are actually heavy smokers. I mean, they pack a day and have higher rates of smoking than people with fewer disorders. So even in the population of people that have disorders, heavy smokers, many disorders have been also included with that. So there's two conclusions to this. Mental illness causes smoking. So the evidence for that is people who smoke report assistance with attention and concentration. They get increased energy because it's a stimulant, but they also feel like they have lower anxiety and it has some kind of calming effect. And that's because nicotine can and does release dopamine and stimulates reward centers of the brain, like the thalamus, amygdala, and the nucleus accumbens. And then the nicotine receptors on different neurons regulate the release of things like serotonin, acetylcholine, GABA, and glutamate. So people, they've said, are using it to self-medicate. The other argument that's more new is that smoking triggers the onset of mental illness. And the things of which the evidence they've shown for that is that lifetime prevalence of MDD is linked to the number of cigarettes consumed. And so that causation goes the opposite way. They found that adolescents in studies found that smoking predicted the onset of depressive symptoms. They also found that positive association between smoking and the severity of anxiety disorder. And in studies with schizophrenia, they found that most schizophrenias, about 90% of the patients had started smoking before their illness began. And of course, we're talking about people who are vulnerable. Not everybody who's smoking is going to develop schizophrenia. But if you are vulnerable and have some of the other components, such as genetics or biological brain issues and abnormalities, then you could, they're saying, develop some kind of disorder. So it's kind of interesting to look at even something as controllable as smoking that can create disorders. Okay, so let's move on to eating disorders. These are interesting. I have one for the childhood one. They kind of mentioned it in the book, but wanted to add one in here for you. So this is a category in DSM-5 called eating and feeding disorders, and it has a huge amount of array of different disorders. It's not just the typical or anorexia or bulimia. One of the infant and childhood disorders that they had that's a new one in there is rumination disorder. This one is quite interesting. This is a new disorder they found. What they found was infants or younger children were eating their food, swallowing it, and then causing themselves to throw up, and then re-eating what they threw up. So again, they regurgitate the food, they spit it out, and then they end up eating the food again. Well, some of the effects on that is malnutrition and some weight loss. Also gagging, it's creating this kind of reflex because they're doing it often. And then also tooth decay because as they're throwing up, that acid is sitting in their mouth and so forth. And it's like I said, it's a new disorder and behavior that they've had to put in there because it's gotten enough diagnosis with it, and they were just trying to figure out what these kids were doing. And it was a pattern that infants and some children were doing. Most of what we were going to talk about is adolescence and early childhood, your anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. And so most of these disorders that we talk about with anorexia and bulimia, especially are female related because of body image. So with anorexia, there's definitely the symptoms are maintaining a minimal normal weight as opposed to bulimia. And a body weight that would be normal for their age, their height, and their gender. Okay, so that's important because everybody would have a different BMI based on who they are and their height and age and so forth. So it's an extreme and severe disturbance in eating and calorie intake. Even I've heard anorexic patients talk about how they didn't want to eat gum because gum has 5 calories in it, and that was 5 calories too many. So this is like extreme disturbance. Intense and afraid of gaining weight and becoming fat. And again, as you see that picture there, there's a perception of the size of the body and is that perception is off. they are really skinny, and when they look in the mirror, they don't see the same size as the reality. So even an emaciated person would perceive themselves as being overweight. So in this case, the effects of that are obviously severe malnutrition. It causes disruptions in body chemistry that are similar to starvation. They're unable to retain any body heat, so they develop this fine hair called linago, and they have their basal metabolic rate, glucose, insulin, and leptin are all decreased, which are going to help them to eat and feel like they want to eat. There's also a drop in hormone levels, so their menstrual cycle should stop. And in males, there could be some sexual dysfunction, so the function of their penis would not work, and there would be a disruption in sexual drive. So in terms of bulimia, what's the symptoms for that? There is a fear also with anorexia in terms of, like anorexia, with weight gain and preoccupation with body shape and weight. The difference here is they're going to stay their normal weight or even slightly overweight. So they don't see the skin and bones type of pictures that you saw before. There's a recognition that they do have an eating disorder. They know that something's wrong, and that's why they hide a lot of the vomiting that they do. This is characterized by extreme periods of binge eating, 50,000 calories in a single binge, and they do twice a week binging. And it's triggered by negative feelings or even just being hungry. And they want that high caloric food that can swallow easily, that's sweet, so ice cream, cake, and candy, but it doesn't have to always be just that. But that typically tends to be the first thing they go to. And then definitely keeping the binge as a secret. And because it's a secret, as you see that girl there eating a bunch of food in the bathroom by herself, there is guilt and disgust and being ashamed. So following the binging in the cycle is purging. And that could be either from vomiting, laxatives, or emenas, like if they had ingested it and now they can't throw it up, so they're going to take it out the other way. And this is going to create a lot of psychological relief to them. If they're not purging, then they might be fasting after that point, and really excessive exercise. And excessive exercise, even when wearing like really baggy clothes, can be something that you can see that's sort of a sign that something's wrong. Definitely there's effects obviously on the body as well. It can be very fatal. Obviously anorexia, like you're depleting your body of any kind of nutrition. So major organs are going to shut down, and heart failure can happen. And similar thing can happen with bulimia as well. So with the effects of bulimia, that can disrupt the electrolyte balance, which can lead to muscle cramps, irregular heartbeat, and some cardiac problems. From the stomach acid, if they are self-inducing vomiting, it can erode tooth enamel. They can have tooth decay as a result, in gum disease, and then they can affect their gastrointestinal tract as well. And then lastly is binge eating disorder. And this is frequently consuming unusual large amounts of food and feeling unable to stop eating. So this really has nothing to do with body image or anything like that. It is the compulsory feeling of wanting to eat. They are embarrassed about overeating and vow to stop. They feel such a compulsion though that they can't resist those urges. There's no purging or behaviors to rid food access, although they may do exercise and diet to regain control. So the cycle for this one is they feel deprived, they have an overwhelming urge to eat, they then binge eat, they feel out of control and ashamed of that, and decide to diet to regain control. And so the symptoms that you might see with someone binge eating, eating unusually large amounts of food in a specific amount of time. So for instance, over a 2-hour period. This is not your normal Christmas, Thanksgiving thing. Feeling that your eating behavior is out of control. You can't stop eating. Eating even when you're full or not hungry. Binge episodes. Eating until you're uncomfortably full. Eating alone or in secret. And then feeling also depression, disgust, ashamed, guilt, or upset about the eating. And then frequently dieting or eating normal meals, possibly without weight loss, to try to gain control. Obviously, the effects are first of all going to be obesity. And with obesity, then you have heart disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, joint issues, but also there's also the ideas of social isolation, that can come with like great weight gain and not being able to function at work very well because you're always distracted by eating and the urge to eat. The disorder also can develop other disorders like anxiety, depression, bipolar, and substance abuse disorder. That is now a disorder in DSM-5, but that's basically just substance abuse. So causes of eating disorders in general, they've talked about, again, neurotransmission, a decrease in serotonin, so that good feeling neurotransmitter can contribute to eating disorder occurrences. And it can also lead to other things such as MBD, your substance abuse disorders, personality disorders, OCD, and anxiety disorders as well that help contribute to that. Could the reduction in neurotransmitters also be a result of the eating disorder? That's a yes. So it could also work in reverse. So they haven't quite figured out, what came first. Is it because serotonin's down, or is it because of some other disorder, or is it, the neurotransmitters down because the eating disorder is made in that way? Second thing is family interactions. This is really important because, and that with number 4 as well, with the media, is critical comments by parents and siblings and also peers. Having some kind of comments about a person's weight or also, and comments about that on a consistent basis, types of bullying that might happen. So people being really critical about people's weight, friends being critical about people's weight, and parents modeling eating disorder behavior, for instance, as well. So peers and parents need to be really supportive in talking about healthy eating and not talking about weight. And also is that social norm with media, is that in the media you're totally in a Western culture, and so that attitude towards thinness and dieting is really pushed in our face, and so that can also contribute, and especially with family or in peer interactions, that can throw a person who's vulnerable towards an eating disorder. Also, personality characteristics. A lot of women talk about they are perfectionists, and they have been always a perfectionist in childhood. And so their schoolwork's perfect, they always follow the rules, and so they are also vulnerable to that need for control. One story I heard was a girl was a soccer player, and a dietitian came in to talk about healthy eating for athletes because her personality was perfectionism and she wanted to be an elite soccer player. She took that to the extreme and started to eliminate foods and only eat certain foods, and that turned to her going to anorexia, and then once she was discovered, she went to bulimia because her weight would still be there, but then she'd still have control over the eating part. So that can be something to think about too. Anorexia, of course, is a culture-bound syndrome of the United States. So as we talk about culture-bound syndromes, there are specific ones. Hikikomoro, which is the picture that you see there, is this is one of the pictures of a man, a young kid in Japan who is socially withdrawal. You can see, it almost looks like hoarding, but not quite. But he's living always in a small room. He's withdrawn himself from his family and from society, and they're there almost sometimes for years. They refuse to interact with family. They play video games or surf the net. There's no school, no job, nothing. And most in Japan are young males, as opposed to a lot of disorders in the United States that you see females suffer from. And they feel like now there's 1 million or more young Japanese males that are affected today by this disorder. And they think it's caused by social pressures and conformity to social expectations, as Japan is a collectivist society. And they also feel that because of the symbolic relationship between son and mother, and the parents not being opposed to the kids being dependent on them and interdependent instead of independent that the US would have, that it's more tolerated as a disorder and than more Western cultures. So they feel like the combination of those two things has sort of pushed these men who are vulnerable into this scenario. So in terms of eating disorders in other cultures, I learned this a long time ago that there's some cultures that do not recognize that eating disorders is a thing, which is why and one of the women in the book talked about how until she, it was a scientist from China, until she went to Great Britain, she didn't know what an eating disorder was. And then she came back and realized that people in that culture actually did have an eating disorder, just wasn't diagnosed and it wasn't prevalent. So some cultures will have eating reduced because of religious purification. In China, like I said, there's no eating disorders until they start looking. Um, and young women for instance, in Hong Kong, they're not fearing being fat as opposed, like in terms of their anorexia, they make excuses that their extreme thinness is because they have a physical problem, like a poor appetite or something wrong with them. And they're less likely, it was thought that they were less likely to to follow fashion because they were less privileged and maybe not as exposed to Western ideals. And this was until a young girl died in the middle of the street, and she was 75 pounds. And it really opened up the doors in people in Hong Kong about anorexia. You know, why would she starve herself? And a lot of them blamed the influx of Western influence on those in China. And so as a result, you kind of look at, are cultural distortions a disorder is a result of media being shared, or is it because people are just more aware and it's being more diagnosed? There's definitely an idea of like slimming diets, clinics, and drugs are growing industries across Asia, and they are attributed to the spread of Western ideals. And so with movies and magazine covers and famous actors and actresses coming a lot from and mainly from the United States, you can see how that would sort of penetrate other cultures. And this is a list of different common culture-bound syndromes. One we talked about before is the muck in Malaysia, aggressive, violent behaviors characterized and sort of dissociative episodes. In Alaska, there's an abrupt disassociative episode like characterized by convulsions, seizures, and coma. In Latin America, we talked about the attack on the nerves. And then brain fag in West Africa, it's difficulties in concentrating, remembering, and thinking. And then in Malaysia, the koro is a common one. Sudden and intense anxiety, the penis will recede into the body and possibly cause death. That's an interesting one. And then the evil eye, a common idiom to describe disease, misfortune, and social disruption. So it's been around for years. And then Winigo is a morbid state of anxiety with fears of becoming a cannibal and cannibalism, eating other people. So these are examples of culture-bound syndromes that are very, specific to those cultures.